Now we're going to install our piston and rod assembly. To do that, you're going to need your crankcase, your piston, and a piston ring compressor. Mr. Lentino, take it away.
All right. The first thing I'd like you to do is remove these head bolts. They're just going to be in the way, so we're going to set them aside, and we're not going to forget to reinstall them at the end of this procedure. Our piston and rod assembly first has to be disassembled from the bearing cap. Now, the purpose of the piston ring compressor is to fit the piston rings into the grooves tightly so they fit inside of our cylinder bore without hitting the top of the cylinder. To use the piston ring compressor, it's spring loaded, and we're going to use a square key to tighten the piston ring compressor, which pulls the piston rings into the assembly. Once that's tight, you should note all the piston rings should be securely in their grooves. Now, before we install it into the cylinder block, the engine block cylinder, the arrow of the piston should be facing downward. So here's your cylinder. The arrow inside the piston should be facing down. At this point, we need to add some additional lubrication so these moving components do not start with too much friction. First, we're going to take our engine assembly grease, just a small amount, and we're going to place it on the connecting rod journal and try to get all the way around it. Now, you should have a sufficient enough grease on your hand still to lubricate the inside of the cylinders. If you don't, you can add a little more, but try not to use too much. So now that we have enough lubrication, it's time to install our piston. To install the piston and rod assembly, you want to make sure that your rod bearing journal is at the 7 o'clock position, which means that the weights will be at about the 2 o'clock position. You're going to need your partner to hold this because gravity is going to want to take over. Once again, ensure that our piston arrow is in the downward position. Be careful not to score the inside of the cylinder while you're placing your connecting rod in. Now it's very important to hold the piston ring compressor firmly against the engine block in order for the rings to pass through. At this point, we're going to use a dowel rod to gently tap the top of the piston into the cylinder.
All right, it looks like we're having a little bit of difficulty.
Yeah, that's true. So if your piston is not sliding out of the piston ring compressor easily, you may have to rethink what you're doing. So let's remove the piston and rod assembly gently.
Another question I have, why are we using this tapping rod?
Oh, that's a great question, Mr. Carr. We don't want to use a metal object because you could crack or score the top of the piston. So we have a wooden dowel with a soft rubber end to it. All right, now to release your piston ring compressor, it's spring loaded and there's a lever on this side of it that you gently press down and it will spring open. Try not to let it spring open too far or it'll just be more difficult when you tighten it up. At this point, get some engine assembly lube and lubricate the inside of the piston ring compressor. This should make it easier for us to install our piston. All right, once again, place your piston in the piston ring compressor. Use the square key to tighten the band on the piston ring compressor. Verify once again that your arrow on your piston is facing downward. Make sure your partner has the crankshaft connecting rod journal in the 7 o'clock position. We'll take our wooden dowel. Once you hear that pop, verify that you installed it correctly with your arrow in the down position. Verify that your connecting rod journal can still freely move around the 7, 8 o'clock position, and that your connecting rod moves freely up and down in the cylinder bore. Once you have verified all of this, now we're going to install our bearing rod cap.
At this point, we're not going to torque it on, we're just going to put it on by hand.
Now, don't be afraid to manipulate the engine in a position to where you can work freely. And you can rotate the crankshaft wherever it would be easier for you to install the connecting rod. Now when we put the bearing cap on, if you recall, we had the oil slinger at the 6 o'clock position.
Can you tell us what's the point of having this oil slinger?
Oh, that is a great question, Mr. Carr. So engines require lubrication. Engine oil. Engine oil on an automobile is force-fed throughout the crankcase and camshaft and crankshaft. But on a small engine like this one, this oil slinger or dipper, as the engine rotates, will dip into the engine oil and actually sling oil all over the metal components that are rotating and that require lubrication.
Okay, yeah, we don't have any pumps pumping oil around this one.
Now you're going to install your two 10mm bolts into your rod. And when you do this, you don't want to run one all the way up and then start the other. You want to go back and forth between the two bolts.
Tell us again, why are we not tightening just one bolt all the way down?
For even torque, if you tighten one bolt and not the other, then you might have an uneven torque on this connecting rod journal. And we don't want that due to parts having too much friction or warping. After you've gotten both of these bolts finger tight all the way up to the connecting rod cap, then we're going to wait for further instructions and we'll be torquing these down later.
Okay, time for you to get your piston assembly in your case. Get to work.